we started off talking about the Ukraine and Russia, and one of the things that folks are confused about was that Russia or the Soviet Union was an ally during World War II. Why was it so important, and why did they want to neutralize Russia and knock them off the box after World War II?
Well, to make a long story short, the Soviet Union were the major force in the Second World War that destroyed Nazi Germany and their allies. Over 27 million Russians died in World War II, compared with 565,000 Americans. Okay, the Russians fought on their own land in 41 to push the Germans back out of the Soviet Union, and eventually they were the ones that captured Berlin, and Berlin was divided into zones. But now the Soviet Union were allies with Great Britain, the UK, the United Kingdom, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia. They were all part of the Allied forces, but the Allies didn't really. They brought to bear the industrial might of the United States, because the United States was never actually attacked physically, as the states, the homeland, was never attacked physically by the enemy. So the United States began to turn out weapons and mass produce armaments to the point where it became the best armed and well armed nation on the planet. And the only one it had a rival with was the Soviet Union at the end of the war. The Soviet Union had already occupied almost all of Eastern Europe, and began to institute socialist governments and communist governments in Poland, in all of Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia. In all of these nations. The history of these nations, if we go to examine them, we'll see that after the Soviet Union left, they began to change and transform. Yugoslavia broke up, and we had the war in Kosovo and all of that stuff. So the Soviet Union was the only power left standing with the United States at the end of World War II. It was the most powerful country in the world territorially. It had more territory than the United States. And Russia today is the largest nation on the face of the earth. It encompasses almost all of Asia. You see, and so the Soviet Union was never susceptible to coups from the outside, and the U.S. instigating and mobilizing military coups and undercover overthrows of government. It was never that vulnerable. But the leadership in the Soviet Union was always European, even though the major landmass of the Soviet Union was Asian. And so in that sense, the Russians were as much racist and white supremacists as their Western counterparts, but because of their ideology, because of their organization after the collapse of the Tsar in 1918, at the end of World War I, and the rise of the communists, but it was because of the communists and the socialist ideology of the Soviet Union. It was because of that ideology that they reached out to the liberation movements in the colonial South, in the colonized South, in Africa, and in Latin America, and trained many of the soldiers and the revolutionaries in Mozambique, in Guinea-Bissau, in the Congo, in Mauritania. In all of these armed struggles, it was the Soviet Union that provided the training and the logistics and the education for the liberation forces. And it was the United States, on the opposite, that fought their proxy wars in Africa, that financed the Jonas Savimbis and the Mobutus and and these reactionaries that robbed Africa and raped Africa in the name of themselves, and so we really need to understand that the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, it was when Gorbachev agreed to dismantle the Soviet bloc nations. It was weak economically. The United States, the Cold War, had drained the Soviet Union economically, and it was also the fault of the Soviets because they had the ability to actually undermine European and international finance capital. Because at that time, during the collapse, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia and the Soviet Union, before its collapse, was the second largest producer of gold in the world. They had one of the largest gold reserves in the world. And they never used it in the Cold War, because if they would have dumped that gold on the market, it would have completely destabilized the United States and its disengagement from the gold standard. They could have changed the whole paradigm of international finance capital, and they didn't. And this is one of the criticisms I made of the Soviet Union, that they were state socialists, they were state communists. They never were about genuine socialism for the masses of working people in Russia. They were always looking towards Europe for their cultural and their cultural identity in terms of their ideals, and it was always European. Right. And so when they collapsed, it opened up the floodgates to the West. They began to move the frontiers of NATO closer and closer to Russia, and we need to understand why that was. Why did the European Union come into existence? Well, at the end of World War II, all of the economies of Europe, the former colonial nations, was devastated. They were basket cases. England was bankrupt. Right. France was bankrupt. Italy was bankrupt. All of these nations were bankrupt. And it was the U.S. that through its Marshall Plan, it floated an almost $1 trillion plan to revitalize Western Europe and bring it back up to standards so that it can be the partners to the United States, so that the United States can then exercise its hegemony over the world in the guise and in the pretext of being of the Western civilizational process. So Germany was reunited in 71, 72, around there. Around then, Germany was reunited, and the wall was taken down. It was much later than that. I'm sorry, my bad. 79.
Yeah, I think 79, 80, somewhere around there.
79, 81, yes, 79 to 81, and so these economies have been revitalized by the United States, and the United States had troops in Western Europe. The United States poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the military structures of these nations, bringing them up to par. The only reason that the French are at the table in the United Nations Security Council is because they developed the bomb. They have a nuclear weapon. Same.
That was 89 with the Berlin Wall. That's right. 89. Yeah.
89. Yeah. Because my first tour of Europe, in Germany, I had to deal with these fascist gangs from Eastern Europe. That evolved because fascism became fashionable in Eastern Europe because it was opposed to the state, to the communist state. But so young people, they took to right-wing fascism, in opposition to the repression and the rigidity of the Soviet bloc nations. It was because the ideological antithesis of communism in the 30s and in the 20s was fascism.
Right.
So with these weakened economies after World War II, the United States went on a campaign to revitalize them. Some of these nations tried to reclaim their territory, like France. France went into Vietnam to reclaim its territory in Vietnam, and we know how that turned out. They got defeated by Ho Chi Minh at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and they had to withdraw. The United States then took up the fight for them, even though the United States had supplied the French with this military equipment. We also know what happened in Korea before then, in 1949 and 1950, when it was clear that Kim Il-sung of North Korea and their Soviet backers were poised to take over the whole peninsula of Korea. Okay, because the Japanese occupied Korea during World War II, and when they were defeated, their armies weren't defeated in Korea; they surrendered.
Right.
You see, and it was only in the last days of the war, after they had dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the Russians declared war on Japan.
Right.
And moved in to occupy certain territories that the Japanese army had occupied in Malaysia, which has changed its name now, and Korea, and in Nepal, India, all of these places where the Japanese had to surrender, the Russians and the Soviets took over. Right. And so the United States felt that communism was spreading as a result of the collapse of the British Empire and the French Empire. And so they had to fill the gap. And so the Korean War was that pretext. They brought some slime bag. I think his name was what was his name? They brought him some Koreans. What was his name? His name is on the tip of my tongue. They brought him in to rule over South Korea, in order to thwart the communist takeover of Korea, which led to the Korean War, and the U.S. Threatening China, moving up the peninsula under MacArthur, threatening China, and the Chinese, came across the Yalu River en masse and forced the Americans back to the 38th parallel. And it's been that way ever since. The Korean War is still is not over. Right. It's been declared. It's been declared a deadlock. It's an armistice, something like that. But it's not over. There's right. Still the demilitarized zone. The U.S. still has troops in Korea and in Japan. So after the Korean War, that was actually the first real military a defeat of the U.S. military after World War II. Right. Then came Vietnam, and that long protracted struggle in Vietnam, and Vietnam practically tore the United States apart. The right. Vietnam War. It radicalized the whole generation of white youth. It radicalized African Americans in the United States. The Black Panther Party, for instance, had a working coalition, an alliance with the NLF and North Vietnamese. It was the same throughout Europe in terms of the Black Panther Party had solidarity with the Palestinians. They had solidarity with the movements in Africa. So the Black Panther Party, when we had our offices in Algeria, were the crossroads of many of the liberation movements in Africa, met and worked with the Black Panther Party consulate in Algeria. So solidarity between movements was very important for Black nationalists then, for the Black Power movement then.
Not to cut you, but do you think that and I know we're cutting, but do you think that Malcolm's work traveling abroad and meeting with heads of state, do you think that it provided a inroad for folks like Dewey and Eldridge and Stokely and other to come through?
Absolutely, because it was Malcolm. It was Malcolm in his journeys to Africa that understood the decolonization process at that time, and that understood that there was a link between what was happening in Africa and what was happening in America to Black people who were engaged in the struggle for human rights.